The night sky above the Ruhr burned like the inside of a furnace. Beneath it, the black outline of a Lancaster bomber carved through the smoke, its engine straining as tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit like molten rain. Inside, the crew said nothing. Sweat dripped from their oxygen masks even as the temperature outside hovered below freezing. A faint tremor ran through the fuselage, flak bursts hammering the air close enough to rattle teeth. Steady, the voice of Wing Commander Guy Gibson was barely a whisper over the intercom. His gloved hands gripped the control column tighter, eyes fixed on the green glow of the altimeter. 60 feet, 55, 50. They were flying lower than any bomber had ever dared, skimming the water at the speed of death. Behind them in the bomb bay, a steel cylinder the size of a small car rotated like a turbine, gathering momentum. The bouncing bomb, Barnes Wallis's impossible invention, waited for its first leap into history. Tracer fire erupted again, slicing through the darkness. A German searchlight locked on for a heartbeat, then another, beams converging like spears. Gibson's second pilot shouted, "We're too low!" But Gibson didn't flinch. His orders were simple, absurd, divine. Aim at the moon's reflection. The angle was insane, his training suicidal, but he knew the geometry was perfect. Ahead, the Ruhr Dam rose from the mist like the wall of a sleeping giant. Bombs away. The Lancaster leapt as the weapon dropped, skipping once, twice across the lake like a stone thrown by God himself, each bounce a flash of reflected moonlight, and when it struck the dam, the earth itself seemed to breathe in. Then came the explosion, a roar that drowned out the war. The wall shattered, water thundering through the valley like a reborn river, washing away years of fear and industry. The radio crackled. Target destroyed. It was the first time the world had seen what the 617 Squadron could do. And they had aimed, quite literally, at the moon, England, winter of 1942. The war had entered its 5th year, and the Luftwaffe still prowled the night skies. London smoldered beneath scars of fire. In factories across the Midlands, workers built bombers faster than the Germans could shoot them down. Yet the Reich's beating industrial heart, the Ruhr, remained alive. The British could hit it, yes, but not kill it. Every bombing raid left the Germans wounded, never crippled. What Britain needed was a miracle, and the miracle arrived in the shape of a soft-spoken engineer who believed water could destroy stone. Barnes Wallis was not a soldier. He was a dreamer in a lab coat, a man who saw war as an equation to be solved. In his cluttered office at Vickers Armstrong, he filled notebooks with sketches of impossible ideas, rotating torpedoes, pressure waves, and one night, a simple drawing of a sphere bouncing across water like a child's toy. It was absurd. It was genius. He had watched newsreels of the German dams, the Möhne, Eder, Sorpe, massive structures feeding the Ruhr's steelworks and munitions plants. They were protected by geography and reinforced concrete thicker than a castle wall. No bomb could reach their bases, unless it skipped across the water like a pebble. Wallis tested the idea in secret using marbles and bathtubs, watching tiny splashes as the spheres bounced and struck the wall of his sink. The principle was perfect, the physics merciless. If a bomb could skip across the surface, hug the dam, and detonate underwater at the base, the shock wave would multiply 100-fold. The dam wouldn't just crack, it would implode, but convincing the RAF was another matter. When Wallis presented his idea to the Air Ministry, the room erupted in laughter. "We're not in the business of stone skimming, Wallis," one officer sneered. But the engineer persisted. He built models, diagrams, and finally, in early 1943, a full-scale test at Chesil Beach. A modified Wellington dropped a spinning steel bomb that skipped across the bay exactly as predicted. 5, 6, 7 times, before slamming into a cliff and detonating with such force that the blast shook houses 2 miles inland. The skeptics stopped laughing. The air staff gave the project a name, Operation Chastise. Wallis was told to find a squadron willing to fly his impossible mission, low-level, at night through flak across occupied Europe, to hit a target invisible until the last 20 seconds. They found their man in Wing Commander Guy Gibson, a 24-year-old veteran of over 70 bombing operations. His reputation was legend, precise, fearless, but tired. He'd seen too many good men vanish into the night over Essen and Hamburg. When they offered him command of a special squadron for a special target, he hesitated only long enough to light a cigarette. Within days, number 617 Squadron was born. Its recruits came from across the Commonwealth, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Englishmen hardened by fire and youth. They arrived at Scampton to find empty hangars, unfamiliar aircraft, and orders that made no sense. "You will be flying at night," Gibson told them, "at exactly 60 feet over water. You will not use bomb sights. You will not climb. You will aim using the reflection of the moon." The room fell silent. Someone muttered, "He's joking." He wasn't. Training began under conditions no sane pilot would accept. The modified Lancasters, stripped of armor to carry the massive rotating bomb, handled like drunk elephants at low altitude. The new aiming device was a crude triangle of wood and light bulbs, designed to align the dam's towers at the correct distance. They practiced over Derwent water in the Welsh reservoirs, flying so low that waves splashed their fuselages. Villagers woke to the thunder of engines as black silhouettes skimmed across moonlit lakes, bombs whirring beneath them like spinning hearts. Men learned to judge altitude by instinct, not instruments. The altimeter lied. At 60 feet, radar was useless, and one mistake meant impact. "If you can't feel the water on your belly," Gibson told his crews, "you're too high." Each night they trained, losing men to accidents before ever seeing enemy fire. Yet morale grew, bound by madness and pride. They were no longer ordinary airmen. They were gamblers in the service of geometry. By May 1943, Wallis's bomb, codenamed Upkeep, was ready. A 9,250-pound cylinder packed with Torpex explosive, spinning backwards at 500 revolutions per minute. Drop it at 240 miles per hour, 60 feet above the water, exactly 425 yards from the dam, and it would skip over the defensive nets, strike the wall, sink, and detonate. Miss by 10 feet and it was suicide. The world would never know of the weapon until it was used. Even within 617 Squadron, secrecy was absolute. They called themselves the Dambusters, but none yet believed the title would mean anything beyond a newspaper fantasy. The night of May 16th approached, the moon bright and cruelly clear, and in the mess hall, men smoked in silence while Wallis stood apart, hands trembling, knowing that if his math failed, he would have built a coffin of steel for the finest pilots in the RAF. When the signal came, Operation Chastises Go, Gibson merely nodded. He turned to his men. "Tonight," he said, "we aim at the moon." The moon rose cold and full over Lincolnshire, a silver coin stamped into a velvet sky. And below it, the airfield at Scampton shimmered with frost and noise, as ground crews swarmed around the dark hulks of 19 Lancasters, engines idling, propellers chopping the mist into ribbons of smoke. Each machine carried a name chalked in white on its black nose. AJG, AJM, AJA, call signs that would soon echo across history, though none of the men knew it yet. Floodlights cut through the gloom as armorers loaded the massive spinning bombs, each one glinting dully under the hangar lamps, a monster of mathematics and steel, and the smell of oil, sweat, and ozone filled the air. Gibson walked between the aircraft with his dog, Nigger, trotting at his heels, nodding to his crews, eyes unreadable behind his flight goggles. He was calm because he had to be. His composure was a weapon sharper than any blade. In the mess hall hours earlier, he'd spoken little, sipping black coffee while the others joked nervously, their laughter hollow, their cigarettes burning down to trembling fingers. Now, with engines growling like distant thunder, he climbed into his cockpit and strapped himself in. The ritual so practiced it felt like fate. At precisely 21:28 hours, Gibson gave the signal. The first wave roared down the runway, heavy bombers trembling under the strain, wheels lifting from Earth with seconds to spare. Behind them, the second and third waves waited in silence, engines muted by the wind. The radio crackled, formation green rolling, and then the night swallowed them whole. Over the North Sea, the Lancasters dropped to treetop height, engines straining as they skimmed the waves so low that spray struck the fuselage. The altimeters spun uselessly. Only the moon's reflection on the black water kept them level. At such altitude, there was no margin for error. A single gust, a single hesitation, and they would disintegrate into the sea. But the men trusted the geometry more than fear. They trusted Wallis's impossible numbers. Inside the lead plane, Gibson watched the coastline of Holland appear ahead, a faint line of lights, the first sign of occupied Europe. Searchlights stabbed upward, sweeping for the intruders. The radio murmured, "Crossing enemy coast." The crew held their breath. They were now in the lion's throat. Every farmhouse could hide a gun, every canal a battery. Gibson pushed the throttle forward. Below them, the Dutch fields flashed by in silver streaks, canals, windmills, flooded polders, a mirror world rushing beneath their wings. Then flak erupted, black blossoms of fire exploding around them, and the Lancaster jolted like a living thing. Fragments of shrapnel rattled against the fuselage. The navigator shouted bearings through the intercom. The bomb aimer cursed softly under his breath. They flew on, unwavering through curtains of smoke and fire, their shadows chasing them across the ground until even those vanished. Behind them, other crews were not so lucky. One Lancaster struck a power line near Gilzerian and vanished in a ball of orange light. Another was hit by flak near Ham and broke apart in midair, pieces of glowing wreckage tumbling into the darkness. Yet the formation never wavered. Each man flew not for glory, not even for orders, but for the simple refusal to let geometry fail. At 00:05 hours, the radio came alive again. Approaching Mona. Gibson looked down and saw it, a dark mirror of water stretching for miles, hemmed in by two towers like sentinels guarding an empire. The Mona Dam, the target that had haunted Wallis's dreams for years. The bomb aimer switched on the aiming lights, two converging beams forming a perfect circle on the lake below, when the altitude reached exactly 60 feet. "Steady, steady," the voice crackled through the intercom, calm as a surgeon's breath. "Hold it, now." The first bomb released, bouncing across the water like lightning made solid, 1, 2, 3 skips, before striking the dam and vanishing in a column of foam. The explosion rolled through the valley like thunder chained to the earth. The dam shuddered but held. Gibson circled, ordering the second Lancaster to make its run. The flak intensified, tracer fire streaking up like red vines. "Aim for the moon's reflection," he shouted over the radio. The second bomb hit, another flash, another roar. The dam cracked, water jetting from a wound at its base. Wallis, listening back in England, would later write that he wept when he heard the words transmitted next. Third bomb away. Direct hit. The Muna Dam broke like glass. A wall of water 200 feet high surged forward, tearing through the valley, sweeping bridges, factories, and sleeping villages into the void. Gibson, watching from above, saw only darkness turn to white. He led his remaining planes toward the Eder Dam, nestled between steep hills that made approach nearly impossible. They dove through the valley, engines howling, skimming treetops so close that branches scraped the bomb bay doors. The first attempt failed. The bomb struck the crest and exploded harmlessly. The second try nearly ended in disaster. But the third, piloted by squadron leader Henry Maudsley, was perfect. The weapon struck, rolled, and detonated deep beneath the surface. The Eder shuddered, split, and then collapsed in a roar that echoed for miles. By dawn, 11 of the 19 Lancasters had not returned. 56 men were missing. The survivors landed at Scampton in silence, their faces gray with exhaustion and disbelief. Wallis was waiting on the tarmac, his eyes hollow. Gibson stepped down from the cockpit and saluted. "We got the Muna and the Eder, sir." Wallis said nothing, then turned away, tears streaming down his face. "I'd never meant so many to die," he whispered, but history had already written their names. The dams were gone. The Ruhr lay drowning, and the 617 Squadron had achieved the impossible. Dawn came not as light but as silence. Over the valleys of the Ruhr, mist drifted like smoke from a battlefield that no one could yet see. Where once there had been villages, now there was only water, a rolling, churning sea that had swallowed fields, roads, and lives alike. The Moon River, swollen beyond measure, tore through the land like a creature unchained, devouring everything in its path. Bridges crumpled, railways vanished, and factories lay half buried in the rising tide. Somewhere beneath the flood, cows floated upside down, their hooves pale in the moonlight. The first German soldiers to arrive stood speechless on the ridges above, rifles useless against a force that could not be fought. They had been told the British were bombing again. They had not been told the very landscape would revolt. From the air, reconnaissance photographs taken hours later would show a scar unlike anything in modern war, a wound stitched across the map. The dark lake of the Muna reduced to a river of ruin. The dam itself was broken clean through, two towers leaning like teeth in a shattered jaw. The Eder lay the same, its breach a black mouth from which the flood had roared forth. The Sorpe, though still standing, trembled under the pressure. And far downstream, the Ruhr's industrial cities, Hagen, Dortmund, Essen, felt the water's vengeance. Power stations failed, steel mills went dark, factories flooded, trains derailed. For 3 days, the heart of Germany stopped beating, yet victory's light burned cold. In England, the press called it a miracle of science and courage. "Dams busted by moonlight raiders," the headlines screamed. Churchill's war room erupted in applause. But among the men of 617 Squadron, celebration felt like a lie. They had left half their number behind. 11 bombers gone, 56 airmen dead or missing, some vanished into the sea. Others, captured, were paraded through German towns as trophies. Gibson, standing alone outside his quarters, read the casualty list in silence, his cigarette burning down to the filter. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. "They did their duty," he said. "No more, no less." Barnes Wallis, summoned to the Air Ministry the next morning, arrived carrying a briefcase filled with charts and photographs. The generals congratulated him. He barely heard them. When they showed him the reconnaissance images, the dams broken, the valleys drowned, he turned pale. "Look at the villages," he whispered. "Look at the people." The flood had killed more than 1,000 civilians, most of them women, children, and forced laborers from occupied Europe. Wallis's invention had done exactly what he designed it to do, and more than he could bear. That night he wrote in his journal, "God forgive me. I had not thought of them, but war does not forgive, nor does it pause." The Germans moved swiftly. Within days, engineers and prisoners of war were rebuilding the dams, their effort heroic even in defeat. The Reich could not afford to let the water stay free. Thousands labored knee-deep in mud, laying new concrete while Allied planes circled overhead. Within 4 months, the Mona was functional again. The Ader took longer, but it too rose from its grave. The flood had crippled production for weeks, yes, but not forever. The lesson was cruel and clear. Even miracles fade. Still, something intangible had changed. The raid's psychological impact was immense. Across occupied Europe, resistance cells whispered of the British airmen who had defied the impossible. In the factories of the Ruhr, workers paused to stare at the broken horizon and murmured that perhaps the Allies truly could reach them anywhere. Goebbels's propaganda machine spun furiously, branding the attack as terrorist barbarism, but even he could not silence the awe it inspired. For the men of 617 Squadron, new orders came almost immediately. There would be no rest, no peace. The success of the dams had made them legends overnight, and legends were not allowed to sleep. Their next missions were precision strikes using new monstrous weapons. The Tallboy and Grand Slam bombs, earthquake devices capable of splitting tunnels and sinking battleships. They had become specialists in impossible tasks, and the cost of that mastery was their humanity. Gibson knew it. He saw it in their eyes, the hollow stare of men who had looked too closely at death and found it efficient. One evening, as dusk bled over Scampton, the surviving crews gathered in the hangar. They drank in silence, toasting absent friends whose laughter still seemed to echo in the corners. Gibson raised his glass last. "They aimed at the moon," he said quietly, "and they hit it." No one spoke after that. The glasses clinked once, softly, like distant bells. When the newsreels began showing footage of the broken dams, the world believed they were watching triumph. What they were truly seeing was the beginning of a new kind of war. One fought not just with bombs and bullets, but with precision, mathematics, and the quiet ruthlessness of men who had learned that perfection in destruction is its own burden. For Guy Gibson, that burden would never lift. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest honor his country could give, and sent on lecture tours where crowds cheered and women threw flowers. But when the applause faded, he could still hear the sound of the water bursting through concrete, still see the silhouettes of his lost crews disappearing into the night. In 1944, he volunteered for another operation. His plane was shot down over Holland. He never returned. The flood had taken him too, just later, in another sky. And so the story of 617 Squadron became legend, a tale of courage, genius, and tragedy bound together by a single command that defied both logic and death: aim at the moon. Autumn of 1944 came with a sky the color of gunmetal and a wind that tasted of iron. England's fields were brown with harvest and rain, but at RAF Woodhall Spa, The men of 617 Squadron were not thinking of home or seasons. They were studying blueprints of targets buried deeper than imagination. The war had changed. No longer about survival. Now it was about precision, about carving out the heart of an empire with surgical strikes so devastating that even the Reich would bleed from its foundations. In the dim briefing rooms, under yellow lamps and cigarette haze, the faces were older now, lined with fatigue that no metal could erase. Gibson was gone, his name spoken with reverence and superstition like a saint of impossible missions. In his place stood Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire, quiet, patient, brilliant in his own way. He inherited not only a squadron but a ghost, for 617 was no longer just a unit. It was a myth that walked among them, and myths demanded blood to stay alive. Cheshire looked at his men, those who had survived the dams, and the new ones who had come chasing legend, and said simply, "We are not the same squadron that left Scampton. We have a new weapon now." He gestured to the enormous blueprint pinned to the wall. It was the Tall Boy, a 12,000-pound bomb designed by Wallis himself, longer than a man and shaped like a bullet meant for the Earth's heart. "We won't just hit targets," Cheshire continued. "We'll move mountains." The men stared at the drawing in silence, awed and uneasy. Wallis, standing in the corner, adjusted his glasses and said nothing. He had promised himself never to build such things again. Yet here he was, fathering another nightmare in steel. Their first mission was the Saumur Tunnel in France, a key artery for German reinforcements heading toward Normandy. The orders were clear: destroy it utterly. At dusk, the Lancasters of 617 roared off the runway, their bellies heavy with tall boys, the ground shaking beneath their departure. High above the Loire Valley, moonlight broke through scattered clouds, turning the river into a silver scar. Cheshire led them himself, marking the target with a cascade of flares dropped from his Mustang. The enemy fired blindly into the night, tracer streams arcing like red vines across the sky. But the squadron moved with inhuman precision. From 18,000 feet, the tall boys fell silently, spinning toward the earth like whispers. When they struck, the ground convulsed. A pillar of dust and fire rose 1,000 feet high, and the tunnel vanished, buried beneath its own mountain. The concussion rolled through the valley, flattening trees and shattering windows for miles. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained but silence. Word spread quickly. Within weeks, 617 became the Allies' scalpel, slicing through the Reich's infrastructure one vital artery at a time. V-weapon sites, submarine pens, viaducts, each vanished under the weight of Wallis's creations. The men learned to respect his genius even as it haunted them. "He builds instruments of beauty that kill beautifully," one gunner murmured after a successful raid, staring at photographs of the devastation. Cheshire said nothing, but in the mess hall later, he drank alone. By late summer, they faced their most daunting target yet, the German battleship Tirpitz, the Arctic giant hiding in the fjords of Norway, a symbol of Nazi pride that had outlived every attempt to destroy it. For years she had been a phantom, her presence forcing the Royal Navy to keep entire fleets tethered to northern waters. To sink her would be to end a chapter of fear. The plan was simple, impossible, and perfect. Hit her from altitude with the Tall Boy. In early November 1944, the squadron assembled in Scotland under skies bruised with snow. The cold gnawed at the metal of the Lancasters. Frost clung to the wings like a second skin. As dawn bled over the mountains, they took off in formation, black silhouettes against a dying sun. Across the North Sea they flew, the world beneath them endless white. Then through gaps in the clouds the fjord appeared, narrow, steep, filled with shadows, and there she was. Tirpitz, immense, defiant, her guns already turning skyward. The Germans saw them coming, but it was too late. Cheshire's successor, now leading the squadron, gave the command, "Bombs gone." The tall boys fell true. The first struck near the stern, lifting the ship as though by the hand of God. The second hit dead center. A column of fire erupted, followed by a sound deeper than thunder. Tirpitz rolled, capsized, and sank in minutes, trapping nearly 1,000 sailors inside. The fjord boiled with oil and flame. From above, the bombers circled once, watching the end of a monster that had haunted oceans for years. No one spoke. The radio remained silent. It was not triumph they felt, but awe, a quiet horror at the magnitude of their own power. When they returned to base, the reports were clinical. Target destroyed. The newspapers would later print photographs of the upturned hull, hailing 617 as heroes again. But in the hangar that night, the air was heavy with ghosts. Wallis received the telegram at his desk in Surrey, his pencil still poised above new calculations. He read the message twice, then folded it carefully. Success. Tirpitz sunk. Tallboys effective. For a long time he stared at it, then placed it among his papers as though burying a child. The squadron carried on into winter, its name now synonymous with precision. But precision had changed them. The young men who once laughed in the face of death were now quiet, deliberate, almost mechanical. Each mission was a masterpiece of mathematics, each explosion an echo of their own dwindling humanity. They no longer dreamed of peace. They dreamed of accuracy, and somewhere in the dark, beneath the weight of the sky he had helped weaponize, Barnes Wallis prayed that the world would one day forget how easy it had become to destroy mountains, and how simple it was to aim at the moon. The war was dying, but it refused to die quietly. Spring of 1945 spread across England with the faint scent of wet earth and smoke, and at Woodhall Spa, the once proud airfield of 617 Squadron now echoed with the hollow rhythm of routine. The great missions were mostly done, the targets fewer. The men still flew, still trained, still waited for orders that felt like echoes of a fading storm. The hangars stood half empty, streaked with oil and memory. Outside, under the trembling clouds, the Lancasters waited with their bellies full of potential, their propellers glinting like the teeth of sleeping predators. The war would end soon, everyone said so, but no one knew what it meant to stop. Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire walked the length of the runway one morning, boots crunching on frost, coat collar turned high against the wind. He had received word that the squadron would be reassigned to final operations, precision strikes against rail bridges and fuel depots deep in Germany. No more glory, no more headlines, just the slow, methodical dismantling of an enemy already on its knees. Yet the men went through the motions as if the fate of the world still hung on their wings. They were men who had forgotten how to live without purpose. That night, as dusk settled over the Lincolnshire fields, the crews gathered one last time in the briefing room. The map of Europe on the wall was scarred with pins and string, each thread a memory of a night that had changed them. Cheshire spoke quietly, his voice roughened by fatigue. "This is the last of it, lads. One more strike. Then we go home." There was no cheer, no applause, only the faint rustle of paper and the distant hum of engines warming in the dark. They took off just after midnight, a dozen Lancasters rising into the black sky like migrating ghosts. The moon was veiled behind thin cloud, its light diffused into a pale halo that barely kissed the edges of their wings. Below, Europe unfolded in darkness and ruin, cities smoldering, rivers glinting like veins of silver through the scars of war. Flak still waited for them, stubborn and bitter, erupting in orange bursts that lit the clouds from within. But they flew on, unflinching through the shuddering air that had once terrified them but now felt almost familiar, almost home. Over the target, the bombs fell with clockwork precision. Each detonation a heartbeat in the night. Cheshire watched from above as fire spread along the rail yard like veins of molten light. "That's it," he said quietly into the radio. "Turn for home." The words hung in the air like absolution. On the return leg, silence filled the intercoms. The war below them was ending. Factories abandoned, roads empty, the Reich collapsing under its own weight. From altitude, they could see the faint glow of Berlin burning in the distance, a dying star. The navigator murmured, "It's over." But the pilot said nothing. He knew the sky would never truly be peaceful again. As dawn broke over the channel, the first rays of sunlight struck their wings, turning the frost to gold. England emerged from the mist, green, damp, familiar, and for the first time in years it did not look like a battlefield but like a promise. They touched down one by one, engines coughing, tires screeching, men blinking in disbelief as if unsure whether they'd actually survived. Ground crews ran to meet them, shouting, waving, crying. Some of the airmen laughed. Others simply sat where they were, staring through the windscreen at the rising sun. Within weeks, the war in Europe was over. The cheers that erupted in London never reached Woodhall Spa in the same way. The men of 617 Squadron celebrated quietly, if at all. Some packed their kits and left, returning to homes that no longer fit them. Others stayed, helping to test new aircraft, new weapons for wars not yet born. Wallis was among the visitors who came to the airfield that summer. He was older now, thinner, his hair gone white at the temples. He shook Cheshire's hand and said, "You've given meaning to numbers." Cheshire smiled faintly. "And you gave them a conscience." A few months later, the atomic bombs fell on Japan, and the world crossed into an age of unimaginable destruction. When Wallis saw the newsreel footage of Hiroshima, he turned away and whispered, "We have aimed too high this time." His equations, his faith in precision, had led the world to a place beyond repair. He spent the rest of his life designing aircraft for peace, airships, bridges, dreams that could float rather than fall. But in his heart, he knew that the shadow of that night over the Muna would never leave him. As for the men, their lives scattered like the debris of their missions. Some flew in peacetime airlines, others farmed, taught, or drank in silence. A few returned to Scampton for reunions, standing before the memorials that bore their friends' names etched in stone. They would talk of that night in May 43, of the moon's reflection on the water, of the way the bomb had skipped like a heartbeat toward destiny. And when silence fell, as it always did, someone would lift a glass and murmur, "To the ones who aimed at the moon." In 1983, on the 40th anniversary of the raid, the surviving veterans gathered once more at Scampton. The airfield had changed. The runways were cracked, the hangars empty. Yet when the floodlights came on and a restored Lancaster roared to life, the years fell away. The sound shook the night, rolling across the fields like memory itself. Old men stood straighter, eyes shining. Wallis's photograph hung on the wall of the mess, his thin smile immortal. One veteran placed his hand on the glass and whispered, "We were young, and we flew in God's geometry." Above them, the moon hung pale and perfect, reflected faintly in a puddle on the tarmac. And if anyone had looked closely, they might have sworn they saw the reflection ripple, as if something unseen still moved across it, skipping softly through time, carrying with it the echo of courage, of invention, of all the fragile, furious beauty that once defied the dark. The wind rose. The engines quieted. The night returned to silence. The legend of 617 Squadron did not fade. It settled instead into history's marrow, where it would forever live, not as myth, but as truth forged in metal, mathematics, and the hearts of men who turned the impossible into precision, and the moon into a weapon.